middle of the 14th century, Europe experienced a demographic shock so large that contemporaries struggled to describe it with ordinary words. Modern historians refer to it as the Black Death, and in most accounts, its main European phase runs from 1347 to 1351. It did not begin as a European story. Long-distance trade connected the Mediterranean world to the Black Sea, the Near East, and routes reaching deep into Asia. And these links moved more than silk, grain, and silver. Disease could travel along the same corridors, hopping between ports and markets faster than any army could march. Because ships did not need to conquer a coastline in order to touch it, they only needed to dock. The best way to understand how the Black Death took hold is to begin with movement. The movement of goods, the movement of sailors and merchants, and the movement of information and rumor. By the mid-13th century, Italian city-states and merchant networks had strong commercial ties to the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea region, including colonies and trading stations that linked Europe to wider Eurasian exchange. When plague activity intensified in regions connected to these routes, European observers tended to interpret what they heard in moral and religious terms, but the practical outcome was the same. Fear began to spread before the disease itself arrived. The transition from distant rumor to immediate crisis is often associated with the arrival of ships from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean in 1347. A widely cited early point in the European timeline is Sicily, where reports describe ships arriving at Messina in October 1347 and the disease appearing in the city soon after. From there, the pattern that followed was repeated again and again. A port city becomes sick. Some flee. Commerce continues in reduced form, and the illness leaps onward to the next node in the network. Movement that once represented prosperity becomes, in retrospect, the mechanism that distributes catastrophe. For a modern documentary retelling, it helps to separate what people then believed from what evidence suggests today. 14th century Europeans did not know bacteria, vectors, or incubation periods. They did know that death came in clusters, that households could be wiped out in days, and that familiar routines, markets, churches, workshops, taverns, dockyards, could suddenly seem dangerous. Medical theory in Europe still leaned heavily on inherited frameworks, including ideas about corrupted air and bodily imbalance, and responses often focused on smells, fumes, and the cleansing of streets, homes, and public spaces. At the same time, authorities and communities did experiment in practical ways, especially in port cities accustomed to the risks of maritime exchange, even if they did not yet possess the later concept of a scientifically grounded quarantine system. The disease that drove the Black Death is widely thought to have been plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Modern research, including ancient DNA findings discussed in scientific and reference literature, has supported Y. pestis as the causative agent behind medieval plague outbreaks associated with the Black Death. This matters because it allows us to connect medieval descriptions of symptoms and patterns of spread to known forms of plague, bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic presentations, each with different dynamics and levels of contagion. Medieval writers did not use these terms, but they often described signs consistent with them: sudden fever, weakness, and painful swellings, what later writers would call buboes, along with rapid decline and death that could follow frighteningly quickly. Even with a likely agent identified, it is important not to flatten the story into a single, simple mechanism. The Black Death was not merely a medical event, it was a social event, an economic event, and a crisis of meaning. Europe in the 1340s was already under stress from earlier famines and from structural limits in agriculture and urban sanitation. Towns were dense, waste management was primitive by modern standards, and many people lived close to animals. Trade and seasonal migration brought outsiders into constant contact with locals. When plague entered such an environment, it could exploit every weakness: crowded housing, constant movement, and the absence of effective understanding about transmission. After the first Mediterranean outbreaks, The disease moved along coastlines and inland routes. Accounts commonly emphasize a grim geography. Harbors, river valleys, and road networks became lines on a map tracing mortality. The sequence was not perfectly uniform because weather, local density, shipping schedules, and the decisions of individuals all mattered. But by the end of the main wave, much of Europe had been struck. The broad dating, 1347 to 1351, does not mean that the crisis was identical everywhere for 4 full years, but it captures how the pandemic's spread and impact unfolded across regions in overlapping surges. For people living through it, the most immediate feature was the speed with which the ordinary world could be overturned. A healthy person could fall ill and be dead within a short period, leaving families scrambling to find help, food, and someone willing to handle the bodies. As fear rose, so did avoidance. And this avoidance had a practical effect. Care networks broke down. If neighbors refused to enter homes, if priests hesitated to visit the sick, if grave diggers could not keep up, then death became more visible and more socially disruptive, which in turn intensified panic. This feedback loop, illness producing fear, fear producing isolation, isolation producing worse outcomes, helps explain why the Black Death was experienced not only as a wave of mortality, but as a collapse in the confidence that society could function. Cities faced special problems because their strength was also their vulnerability. Urban life depended on daily inflows, food from the countryside, water from wells or conduits, fuel for cooking and heating, raw materials for crafts, and customers for trade. When disease threatened these flows, authorities tried measures that could range from sensible to desperate. Some responses focused on cleanliness and the removal of filth. Others targeted perceived sources of bad air. Still others were attempts to control movement through gates and ports. Yet every restriction carried costs. Stopping ships meant losing grain and income. Blocking roads meant starving towns or ruining the livelihoods of rural sellers. Many leaders hesitated, and while they hesitated, the disease moved. The Black Death also produced a crisis of explanation. When causes are invisible, people search for visible culprits. Rumors intensified. Accusations spread. Minorities and outsiders could be targeted as scapegoats. At the same time, sincere religious reactions expanded. Some people increased devotion, organized processions, or interpreted the plague as divine punishment. Others reacted with cynicism or fatalism, convinced that if death was everywhere, then normal rules had lost their meaning. What makes the period historically important is not that everyone responded the same way, but that the event was large enough to make these choices and conflicts common across regions. Economically, the immediate shock was labor. When a large share of a population dies or becomes too ill to work, every system built on routine work begins to wobble. Fields are left unharvested, workshops go silent, ships lack crews, and local administrations struggle to function. Over time, however, scarcity of labor can shift bargaining power toward survivors, changing wages, rents, and expectations. The Black Death's longer-term consequences are debated in detail by scholars, but it is widely treated as a turning point that contributed to social and economic change, including pressures on older feudal arrangements in some regions. A documentary Reconstruction should also show the pandemic as a chain of local stories rather than a single abstract number. The disease did not hit Europe like a uniform cloud. It struck specific neighborhoods, parishes, streets, and households. It moved along specific routes, from ship to dock worker, from dock worker to family, from family to marketplace, from marketplace to traveler, from traveler to the next town. In this sense, the Black Death can be narrated through ordinary spaces: a harbor where ships unload, a narrow street where waste collects, a crowded room where someone coughs, a church where mourners gather, a rural lane where people flee the city carrying what they can. The tragedy of the period is that many of the behaviors that made medieval life communal, shared water sources, shared worship, shared labor, also increased exposure when a lethal pathogen entered the system. By late 1347 and into 1348, the epidemic's acceleration became the defining experience in many places, especially as the plague reached large cities that acted as hubs for their regions. The Mediterranean world, with its dense maritime connections, provided repeated opportunities for the disease to land, depart, and land again. From there, inland spread followed rivers and roads, often in pulses that corresponded to trade seasons and human movement. The living watched the calendar for signs of relief, colder weather, changes in winds, the passing of an outbreak, only to discover that the disease could return, or that another community not yet struck was about to face its own crisis. In many regions, the months of 1348 became the moment when the Black Death stopped being a coastal horror and turned into a general European reality. Contemporary descriptions emphasize not only the number of deaths, but the breakdown of normal tempo. Courts postponed business, markets thinned out, and households tried to seal themselves off while still needing bread, water, and fuel. The disease did not move at a single steady speed, yet it repeatedly exploited the same logic of connectivity. Wherever people gathered, exchanged goods, or traveled between settlements, the plague found new paths. As mortality climbed, communities were forced to solve problems that are usually invisible in calm times. The dead had to be buried, but burial required labor, tools, space, and willingness. When fear made people avoid contact, even basic care could become rare. Many accounts describe situations in which families faced illness alone, either because neighbors stayed away or because everyone nearby was already overwhelmed. In cities, this pressure was amplified by density, because the number of sick could outpace the number of healthy workers within days. Authorities and institutions responded with the ideas and resources available to them. Civic leaders attempted street cleaning, restrictions on certain activities, and control of movement through gates or ports, though enforcement was uneven and often delayed by economic necessity. Medical practitioners, working with inherited theories, recommended purging, bloodletting, and aromatic substances meant to counter corrupted air. Whether such measures helped or harmed varied, but they rarely changed the overall course of the epidemic. Religious responses were equally diverse. Some people turned toward intensified devotion, vows, and public rituals, hoping to restore a moral order they believed had been violated. Others concluded that ordinary rules had lost their force and pursued pleasure or profit with a kind of fatal urgency. The same event could generate stricter piety in one neighborhood and open cynicism in another. One of the most dangerous social effects of the Black Death was the search for blame. When a cause cannot be seen, suspicion often lands on the socially vulnerable or the politically convenient. Rumors about poisoning wells or spreading disease deliberately circulated in parts of Europe, and in some places these rumors contributed to persecution and violence against minority communities. It is important to frame this clearly in a documentary narration. Such accusations were not evidence-based explanations of disease, but expressions of fear that could be weaponized and could produce real suffering in addition to the epidemic itself. The Black Death also exposed how intertwined urban and rural life had become. Towns depended on countryside food supplies, and the countryside depended on town markets, tools, and credit. When large numbers died, fields could go untilled and harvests could rot, which then threatened survivors with shortages even after the initial wave passed. In some places, however, the demographic shock eventually shifted bargaining power. With fewer laborers available, wages could rise, and tenants could renegotiate terms, while landowners faced pressure to attract workers and keep production going. This did not happen instantly, and it did not happen uniformly across Europe. But over time, the pandemic contributed to economic adjustments that reshaped relationships between employers and workers, landlords and tenants, towns and villages. The crisis also had administrative consequences. Governments and city councils relied on officials, clerks, messengers, and tax collectors, people whose work requires constant contact. When those people died or withdrew, record-keeping and enforcement weakened. Legal disputes were postponed. Property transfers multiplied as inheritances cascaded, and local leaders had to improvise. Even the church, with its deep institutional reach, struggled when clergy died in large numbers, and replacements were rushed into positions with limited training. That loss of experienced personnel mattered, because medieval society depended heavily on institutional continuity for charity, education, and the rituals that helped communities process death. By 1349 and 1350, the pandemic's later surges and regional peaks continued to shape daily life. Some areas were struck hard after hearing of the catastrophe for months, which meant they experienced a double burden: prolonged fear followed by sudden reality. People attempted flight as a strategy, leaving cities for estates or villages, but flight was not a guaranteed escape. Travelers could carry infection, and rural settlements could become outbreaks in their own right, especially once markets and seasonal work connected them back to broader networks. The experience taught a harsh lesson about mobility. It could be a lifeline for an individual, but it could also help the disease outrun local containment. When historians place the main European phase between 1347 and 1351, that endpoint does not imply that plague vanished. Instead, the first and most devastating wave gradually burned out, leaving behind a changed continent and a new awareness that epidemic disease could return. Later outbreaks of plague would recur for centuries, in various forms and intensities, but the memory of the initial shock remained special because it set the baseline of trauma and demographic loss. Communities that survived were marked not only by grief, but by absence: empty homes, abandoned plots, missing craftsmen, gaps in family lines, and a sense that the world had become less predictable. Culturally, the Black Death influenced how people thought about time, death, and the value of ordinary life. Artistic and literary expressions in later decades often carried a sharper awareness of mortality. Public rituals and charitable foundations could expand in response to grief, while distrust and social tension could also deepen. The pandemic did not create every late medieval change by itself, but it intensified existing pressures and accelerated shifts that were already possible: changing labor relations, evolving urban policies, and new attention to public health practices, especially in trading cities that could not afford repeated collapse. If you want a clear final arc for the documentary, close on 3 points. First, the Black Death was a product of connection. Trade and travel made wealth and ideas move, and they also moved disease. Second, it was a test of institutions. Cities, churches, and governments tried to respond with limited knowledge, and their successes and failures shaped how communities endured the crisis. Third, it was a turning point in experience. After 1347 to 1351, Europeans did not simply return to the old normal, because the scale of loss changed how people worked, prayed, governed, and remembered.